We've created a society in which most people kind of don't believe in truth anymore. And I mean, this is nuts. This is a form of mass suicide, and we're in the middle of doing it right now. Now, I want to tell you a little bit more about how it works. I want to tell you a little bit more about how it came to be, and I want to tell you a little bit more about how you can get out of it and why you must, or at least those few of you who I hope to reach today, because I know I won't reach most of you. Maybe I'll proceed with a bit of the story of how we got to this in the first place, because it's just so bizarre. What happened was, back in the 80s and 90s, there was this really strong movement in the culture of digital technology to make everything free and open. This was the open software movement, free software. This was let's make music free, let's make culture open. Design like the Wikipedia is an expression of that time. It was a movement based on the most beautiful ideas, and it was promoted by beautiful people with tremendous sincerity. At the same time that that was happening, there was this other countervailing idea that was also becoming more and more powerful. And that was this idea that there were certain special people, and these people might have been the super hackers, or they might have been the super tech entrepreneurs, the Steve Jobses, let's say. And these people, because they could hack so well, because they were so good at computer stuff, they could change the course of history. They could, the way Jobs put it, he said, you could dent the universe. So it's like this Nietzschean magic. We are the magic people. We're the superheroes. And everybody really believed that. People really loved their hacker heroes. They loved figures like Steve Jobs. And so here you have this problem. You're saying, we have these super people, and a lot of them are entrepreneurs, but then you want everything to be free. Super entrepreneur, free. How do you get those two things to reconcile? It's sort of like this extreme socialism with this extreme libertarianism. Where's the meeting point? So they meet at one point. Nobody's ever articulated another point where they meet, and that one point is what we call the advertising model. So the idea is that services like Google and Facebook were born where the surface experience for the people using them was like the Wikipedia. It's all about connecting, it's about community, it's free. You share, you do these things, and it's beautiful. And yet, there was also this giant business. And indeed, these companies became the fastest growing ones with the biggest fortunes. And right now, you know, the biggest companies in the world are all these types of data-driven cyber behemoths. And before I go any further, I should make it clear that my perspective here is not, oh, these horrible big corporations. I actually kind of love them. I'm part of them. Sold a company to Google very early on, and know a lot of people there, have friends at Facebook. So I don't think vilification of the people at these companies or of the companies is the right way to proceed. I think the right way to proceed is to get them to change, but I'll get to that a little later. So we had this bizarre solution to this conflict between the profoundly felt desire for a kind of an open, everything is somewhere between socialism and anarchy, and then this other sort of hyper-libertarian thing. We wanted them to coexist. So as I say, for the users, it's this open, share, share, but then behind the scenes is something else again. So behind the scenes, what's going on is truly perverse and infuriating, but because it's behind the scenes, you don't see it a lot. I've had occasion to be present when the big companies court big, what are called advertising accounts. I hate the term advertising for this, because if you're constantly measuring the person and adjusting to fine-tune, to find a way to manipulate the person without the person knowing, that's not advertising, that's behavior modification. That's manipulation. We can't use the language of advertising. But anyway, we do. So I'll call the advertisers from here on the manipulators, and I'm going to call the companies behavior modification empires. Is that okay with you? All right, because I just think it's more descriptive. And instead of the term engagement, I'm going to use the term addiction. And I'm not saying some radical out there thing and saying this. A whole series of the earliest top executives of Facebook have come out and regrettably said, yes, we used addictive techniques deliberately. I mean, this is out in the open. I'm not making some radical hypothesis here. All right, anyway, when the companies are selling themselves to their customers, the manipulators, they are really kind of creepy. They'll say, oh yeah, we can target a group of people and change how they think and change what they do. And it's important to understand the power of the system. It can't target you and then with a high degree of accuracy say, I'm going to change you. It's this broad statistical thing. What it can do is it can target 2 million people and say, I'll get 3% of them to change by 5%. It's small. The changes that are reliable are small because they're very distributed, they're very statistical. And you might say, oh, who cares? We're getting free services for just these tiny shades of difference. But the thing is, reliable tiny shades of difference, carefully applied consistently, have a compounding effect. It's like compound interest. You can only do a little bit at a time, but over time you can accumulate quite a significant effect. You can turn elections. You can disrupt a society. You can make things pretty ugly. Now here we get to a very interesting question, which is, I'm talking about the effect of these slight changes. And oh, by the way, the reason I was talking about when they pitch is when the companies pitch, they're incredibly arrogant about how they can reliably change all of you. And yet out in public, they'll say, oh no, we can't really do very much. It's very, very slight. And the thing is, both the sort of meek and modest portrayal and then the arrogant portrayal are kind of true because it is cumulative. It just depends on the frame you're looking at. So here's an interesting thing. Let's say at this point you might be thinking, well, if these systems can be used to modify people, why is it that they seem to be making the world sadder, crankier, more divisive? They seem to be destroying people's ability to perceive truth. They seem to be destroying people's ability to act in their own self-interest. They're disruptive of societies. They're igniting ethnic hatred. They're throwing elections. They're making people distrust their democracies. Now, everything I just said, you might say, prove it, prove it. Is that true? You know, it's a thing, it's very similar to the problem of climate change. It's very hard to prove a particular storm or a particular flood is climate change related, but you can look at the overall rate of them and you can say, well, that corresponds to climate change. Just as with this, there's a large body of research tracking things like likelihood of teen suicide, tracking social media use, and in the book it's filled with footnotes of all kinds of different studies. There's a broad pattern. Is it absolutely definitive? Just as with climate change, for the true skeptic, it can never be. It's a correlative argument. I think we're at the point where we have no reasonable choice other than to accept that the list of accusations I just gave are supported. But I'll leave that to the book and you can chase down the footnotes if you're skeptical. But let me get back to a question, which is, that I suspect some of you have in your head, and that question is, okay, let's say I buy this. Let's say I buy that this behind-the-scenes machine is churning, manipulating people, and it's doing all this damage in the world. Why should it be doing damage instead of good? And here, I want to give you a little bit of insight into how we've screwed ourselves over with the system. And this is something that I'm absolutely certain nobody foresaw. I'm absolutely certain that this is an innocent mistake, even though it's a rather grave and large-scale mistake. I mean, there's a funny thing going on. Like, some of the early Facebook people, like Sean Parker, are kind of recalling themselves as being more like Bond villains than I think they really were. Like he's saying, oh yeah, we knowingly did all this addictive stuff. I kind of knew him at the time, and I think they actually fell into it more innocently, and maybe there's a certain glamour in imagining yourself as a Bond villain. But anyway, this stuff, I'm sure they were not Bond villains. I'm sure this was innocent. So here's how it goes. The algorithms, remember, behaviorism is based on a feedback loop. Your behavior is measured, such as, did you actually buy this thing that you saw an ad for? Or did you click through, or did you just spend more time on the system and be more engaged, which is a prime driver that the algorithms are trying to optimize for? Did you do all that stuff or not? And then it might give you a treat or punishment. Now, so far we don't have little drones floating over us that drop actual candy or shock us with electric shocks, right? So instead, the positivity and the negativity that form the addictive cycle and the behavior modification loop are social experiences, which are incredibly deep and powerful for people. So the positive ones are more rare than the negative ones, and this is always true in addictive cycles. When the gambler is addicted, it's not to winning, but it's to the whole cycle where they lose more often. People with chemical addictions are addicted to a cycle in which they're more often in pain or down than they are having a high. This is a universal character of addiction. So every once in a while, the terminology preferred in Silicon Valley is oversimplified, but it's like, oh, we'll give you your dopamine hit. And the dopamine hit is when you get retweeted or something that validates you happens. But then in between that is a longer and unpredictable period in which you're either ignored or overshadowed or harassed or ridiculed or whatever the hell it is. There's always some kind of negativity in between the dopamine hits. Now, the algorithms are measuring you at a fast frequency. They're every single time you do anything, and these days, because even motion is counted and facial expressions, if you're looking at the camera, this might be a very fast sampling indeed, because your behavior can change quite rapidly. So with this fast sampling, it'll capture those emotional responses which rise the fastest in you. Now, here's an interesting thing. If you ask what kind of responses rise fast, it's true that there are a few sort of pleasant ones, and that's the dopamine hit. But there's a far larger number of negative ones that rise faster. And these include startle responses and becoming scared, becoming angry. And these things happen, they rise fast, and then they decay slowly, kind of like a string on an instrument. They go up fast, and then they take a long time to die down. This is a good sound. Do you hear the siren of the police car? I love how New York police cars kind of talk. There's no other city in the world that's like, you know, there might be a problem here, there might be a problem here, there might be a problem here. Pay attention. It's like it has like intent. It's amazing. There's like this language. All right. So, but that sound, that siren, it's not like this instant on and then it decays. It's like it goes up. Now, the interesting thing is that most positive reactions, such as like gaining admiration, gaining understanding, gaining appreciation, gaining trust, these things build more slowly, but they can be killed very, very quickly. And so if you have a system that's measuring you on a very rapid basis and then giving you feedback, which bundle of emotions is it going to pick up on in order to try to engage you more? Why the negative ones? Because more of them are fast rising. And so there's a weird thing where if you look at people, there's a huge body of published work where experimenters have tried to determine if positive or negative or reward or punishment feedback is more influential. And the results are a fascinating patchwork that depends on the circumstance and the nature of the subject and all kinds of things. Overall, there's a parity. Overall, they're about a balance. But if you measure in this way quickly, you highlight more negative ones. And so therefore, there's this totally unintended result that if there's somebody who wants to either be a paying customer of a service like Facebook or just manipulate their way through it with the way they post on it, either way, they get more bang for their buck when they're negative. So it's naturally a negativity machine because of the timing of the feedback loop. It's a little bit like the problems that sometimes come up with high-frequency trading, where those things can be more prone to certain kinds of illusions in markets. And I don't want to get into a big technical thing about that, but it is true that, for instance, I'll give you a couple of examples. Donald Trump's social media director for the presidential campaign reported, and Facebook disputes this, but this is what he says. He's the customer. Customers are always right, remember. And he says that when they put up a negative ad that was particularly aimed at sort of crankiness, well, these are my words, not his, but these sort of cranky paranoia ads, and racist and whatever, that they would get a giant multiple, maybe hundreds of times more exposure to people than when Hillary spent the same amount of money for an ad that was tamer, because the algorithms reward and amplify things that cause engagement addiction. So negativity just happens to work. It happens to get amplified. Nobody designed it that way. But as long as that's the system we have, and that's this thing that connects us all, the way most people get news, the way most people know their own family and friends, the way most people search for work, so many things like this, it's this giant invitation, this giant red carpet for the society to be manipulated by bad actors, like the Russian intelligence warfare units that threw our last election. I didn't say this until recently. I used to say that might have, but since James Clapper, the retired head of national security, is saying it begs credulity not to say they threw the election, I figure, okay, finally, let's just say it. They threw the election. And the thing is, let's suppose hypothetically that the tooth fairy visited Vladimir Putin and he suddenly got this vision, oh, I want to make the world harmonious and good and I don't care about my own power and a healthy world is good for Russia. I'm not going to be creepy anymore, I repent. And then he calls up his people and he says, can you help the United States heal instead of disrupting it more? And they'll say, well, Vladimir, I mean, we could do this thing, but it would cost 10,000 times more. It's like we're getting this multiplier for disruption. And he would say, oh my God, it would be that expensive. Okay, stay creepy, because creepiness is the bargain way to use this stuff. And so there are many effects of this which are heartbreaking. An example is the Arab Spring was so celebrated in such an arrogant way in Silicon Valley. We called it the Facebook revolution, the Twitter revolution, even though, of course, we weren't there. It was somebody else's revolution, but we claimed it. And the thing is, though, that even though, as with so many other things about social media, the initial benefits that you perceive are authentic, they're not unreal at all. Behind the scenes, the manipulation machine is running, and what it does is it finds the people who are the most engaged, the most emotionally aroused by whatever is going on, and of course those are the people with the negative emotions. They're introduced to each other. The cycle that gets them excited is more and more emphasized and more refined, and then the result down the road is that an organization like ISIS gets even more power from the same tools than the Arab Spring did. Or an example close to home, Black Lives Matter starts off, in my opinion, as a beautiful movement, articulate, generous, forgiving, but the algorithms are searching out those people who are upset by it because impulse is what is captured more than consideration. And those impulsive people are the negative ones for the most part. Once again, this is all statistically, it's not perfect, it's just percentages. These negative people are introduced to each other. Their cycle of negativity is amplified because the algorithms are trying to drive engagement. And then you have a resurgent KKK and neo-Nazi movement that we haven't seen in generations. So what starts off as positivity is turned into something I can't say on C-SPAN. Like clockwork, over and over again. And then people still say, well, we'll use social media to try to fight all the madness that's come about in the social media era, but you can't. You can't. So, in order for us to not drive ourselves to extinction, and I say extinction because we have real problems. We as a species have to find a way to be sane right now.